What's going on, everyone? This is a long-awaited deck profile guide project that I've been looking to put together, and hopefully it will take everybody interested in Pure Melffy from A to Z, from putting a deck together to the different packages, the different combos, down to what packs to open specifically. Hopefully it will be a really robust guide for anybody looking to learn the archetype. If that's something you're into, buckle up, and I hope you enjoy. So here in front of me, I have a brand new account, a lot of gems. I went and did all of the solo missions. So if you are on a new account, highly recommend you do that as well. And we'll be using those gems to buy packs and to build our deck. So let's go ahead and see what that looks like. So right in front of me here, I have a brand new deck, started from scratch. I've titled it Melffy. And before we get too far into the weeds here, I do want to specify that this is a pure Melffy list, not to be confused with other archetypes that do use Melffy, like Spright or Tri-Brigade. I've seen people splash Melffy with things like Vernus and Runic and Vanquished Soul. There's a lot of different ways to leverage the Melffy engine and splash it elsewhere. But this is going to be a video specifically talking about pure Melffy, its strengths, its weaknesses, its combos, etc. So with that in mind, let's go ahead and start taking a look at some of these cards. Now we're going to cover them from left to right, and really quickly, just off the top, every Melffy, well except for Penny and Rabby, every Melffy is going to have this effect where they will special summon themselves from your hand in the end phase onto the board, and then they get triggered by either a normal, a special summon, or being targeted for an attack by an opponent's monster, and that will cause them each to do whatever their specific effect interaction is. They all do that. We're not going to get into that card text for each one of them. We'll be here all day. So Melffy Finny, just need to remember that when it is triggered, it returns to the hand and it special summons one beast monster. Now, that is an important distinction to remember because it's not relegated to Melffys or a specific level, so that allows us to get out of the archetype and search for things like Calantosa. You have Calantosa in your hand. Instead of fishing Puppy, you can fish Finny, get that card out of your hand, still have it achieve its pop, things of that nature. So, not super special. He's worth his place in the list for chain blocking alone. He could still have a lot of value, even if there's nothing in hand for him to summon. Just in protecting your more important Melffy from Ash. Alrighty, now let's take a look at Melffy Caddy. Now, again, same thing as all the other Melffys. Its specific distinction is that when it returns itself to the hand, it will search any beast monster from your deck and add it to your hands. Now again, not relegated to just Melffys or specific level type. It can search any beast, so Alpha, you could fish. Rescue Cat obviously is a big one. Hoppier, Squadron, and Penny are typically the two that we target the most, especially in the early turns. Caddy is probably one of the most important pieces, if not the most important piece, go unnegated in your combo, at least early, because it's what facilitates our synchro engine. Gotta have it at 1 minimum. Sometimes I have it at 2. But yeah, currently that's where I have Caddy. Very, very important piece at 1 minimum. So next up we have Puppy, a very powerful card, just as old as Caddy, been in the list since forever. But Puppy's distinction says that you can return this card to the hand when triggered, then you can special summon one level 2 or lower beast monster from your deck. Now Puppy, because it does special summon to the board, makes it a bit more valuable in that sense, and that's why it has to have the distinction of level 2 or lower beast monster. And because it's not relegated to just Melffys or something to that degree like Wally is, this allows us to get things on the board like Calantosa for a pop, get Kitty Tail on the board so that we can throw something in the graveyard. If Wally is on the board and gets negated, you can simply place Wally with Puppy, assuming they imperm or something like that. You can place Caddy with Puppy, guarantee that you get into the synchro, and yeah, Puppy kind of opens the door to a lot of flexible options without still consuming our synchro engine. Puppy is also really important for times that you want to run things like the Black Rose package or Trishula package or any of those odd numbered synchro packages, because Puppy can place things like Necomane King or Key Mouse, which allows us to get into those a little bit more easily. So next up in the list is going to be Melffy Pony. Melffy Pony's been included in the list since the 6.x iteration, I want to say. And it's a really, really cool card. Now, it allows us to succeed in the grind game so much better than we used to. Pretty much exclusively searching back Penny or Hoppier. But what does Pony do specifically? Pony, when triggered, will return to the hand, and then you can add any level 2 or lower beast monster from the graveyard to the hand. Typically, like I said, you'll fish back your Penny, your Hoppier, the things that allow you to keep going into your synchro boss monsters consistently. And Pony typically kind of replaces Caddy the longer the game goes on, because most of the stuff is searched, right? And it's either on the board or in the graveyard, it's in play. And Pony is the one Melffy that allows us to continue to interact with that. So very important piece. Just gives us more options, and in a deck like Melffy, more options is always dope. So we love to see Pony. Now up next is going to be Wally, the kingpin of the Melffy, so to speak. Wally is a really important piece. One of the newer cards came out alongside Penny and Staring Contest. Just an actually excellent card. It is the one true starter that we have as well. You can just normal summon Wally, pass, and still get into just about anything we could get into. And yeah, very important card to have his effect go off as well. When Wally is triggered, he will special summon 2 different Melffy monsters from your deck. And Wally going off is what allows us to get into Puppy Caddy, right? And then Puppy can chain block for Caddy, so once we get to that point, we're usually safe. Protecting Wally is such an important piece, usually the facilitator of most of the things we do. There are a couple of key things to know about Wally. So as it mentions, you can return this card to the hand, special summon 2 Melffy monsters from your deck with different names from each other, except Melffy Wally. Now, why is that so important? Well, let's say that you already have Caddy and Puppy, Pony, and Finny either on the board or in the graveyard. Well, when you trigger Wally, it's not going to summon anything. All you have left would be 1 Penny, 2 Wallies, and you can't place another Wally from Wally. And if you can't place 2 things, you won't place any. So because you can only place Penny, that's the only thing eligible, that doesn't fulfill the requirement of having to special summon 2 distinct Melffys specifically. And the same thing goes for when you are looking to actually have Wally go off on board. If you have all the other Melffys on board and Wally goes off last, for instance, and attempts to put bodies on the board, but there's not enough spaces, there's only 1 space or something, then he won't summon any, right? So it's very important to make sure, especially when you're chain blocking or organizing your activation orders, that you are making sure that Wally does have 2 places to summon to. Next up on our list, we have Melffy Penny. Melffy Penny, very, very key card, and it is what took Melffy from being an okay deck that can get into some synchro monsters to being a synchro core deck. So what does Melffy Penny do? Well, Melffy Penny, unlike most of the other Melffys, doesn't special summon himself from the hand in the end phase and doesn't get triggered in the way that the others do. So Melffy Penny, he will be triggered anytime a beast monster returns to the hand. So a face-up beast monster returns to the hand doesn't have to be a Melffy. So things like Alpha's effect or Mary Melffy's effect used on one of your own cards, those will work anytime in that turn, right? And that's a pretty key distinction as well, because you can use Alpha in main phase 1, return some cards back, whatever, and then in MP2 you can then use that Penny, because earlier on you returned a beast to the hand with the Alpha effect. So that does come up quite a bit, and you can really catch your opponents off guard by doing that less expected kind of action there. It's important to know that Melffy Penny will, when triggered, will special summon himself from the hand. So it will draw things on like Max C, it will trigger things like Gamma, and it does obviously require a space available on the board as well. So it'll special summon himself from the hand, and then using whatever Melffy bodies you happen to have in your hand at that point, you can use them to synchro summon a monster of a corresponding level. So let's say, for instance, you have just Caddy on the board, it gets triggered, Caddy returns to the hand, Penny gets searched, you can immediately use the Penny effect, special summon himself to the board, then utilize Penny plus the Caddy in your hand to turn into Mary Melffys and return 1 card to the hand. Now, it's because of this behavior that allows Penny to get us into Desert Locust, Excel Synchro, and things like that. So Penny is a very key piece. It's important to know where Penny is at all times. Is he in your graveyard, your deck, your hand, making sure he doesn't get banished. It's very hard to win a game without Penny. Now for the last effect on Melffy Penny here, during your end phase, if this card is in your graveyard just at all, you can target 1 beast XYZ monster you control and attach it as a material. So typically what that's going to look like is attaching from the graveyard to something like Joyous, so that instead of it being able to special summon 2 from the graveyard, it can now special summon 3. Another important thing is to know that it's not relegated to the Melffy XYZs. So you can attach materials to things like Raccoon, for instance. Now for the last card of the core main deck Melffy pieces, we're going to have Melffy Hide and Seek. This is a very important card. Do not leave it out. I promise you will regret it. This is a card that has two different effects. First, we're going to talk about the second effect first, because that's going to be the one that is most utilized. So the second effect states that you can target 3 beast monsters in your graveyard with different names, shuffle them into the deck, and draw 1 card. So a couple of things about this that's important to know based on how it's worded. You can target 3 beast monsters in your graveyard with different names, 3 unique beast monsters. So you can return cards like Alpha or Calantosa, Hoppier, typically the one-ofs that you need situationally. There are times where I will use Hide and Seek, shuffle back cards that if I happen to draw 1 in top deck, what's going to give me the most value, right? So in that case, maybe I'll shuffle back Rescue Cat, Valerawn, Wally. And so it does give you that flexibility. But it's important to know that they have to be different names. So it's not very useful on turn 1 in that respect. At that point, when you're going first, the real value then comes from the first effect and the protection it provides, but we'll touch on that here in a second. So the next thing that's important to know about this distinction in this text here is that once you target 3 beast monsters in your graveyard with different names, you're going to see a lot of people who want to Called by the Grave, one of the 3 you're choosing, or shuffle them back for you with Medora or something like that. Yeah, none of that matters, okay? Because once you've targeted them, you're going to get this effect to go off. If you do get that effect to go off, then you can draw 1 card. In the instance of Medora, they're being shuffled into the deck, you still get your card. In the instance of Called by the Grave, they banish 1, 2 shuffle into the deck, you still get your card. Let's say they have 2 Called by the Graves, they banish 2, only 1 card gets shuffled back into the deck, you still draw 1 card. So because of this, you can obviously understand why Melffy Hide and Seek is a very key piece in the grind game. The later on the game goes, you really need this card out because you can just constantly shuffle back all of your key pieces. Something like Calantosa, Penny, Hoppier, right? And then boom, on your next turn, you have all of those to do all of your combos over again. So Hide and Seek, very strong card. Even lately, it's become more strong because of the first effect here. And that first effect now, this effect here at the top we're going to talk about, it states that the first time each beast monster you control would be destroyed by a card effect each turn, it is not destroyed. Now, again, very important to understand that that's each turn. Now, it also is not limited to just Melffys. So your Alpha is protected just as well as your Hoppier, just as well as your Melffy Rabby, right? That's really, really nice when you open it turn 1 because things like Raigeki, Ghost Ogre, Gamma, obviously remove that body from the board, and it's really, really nice to, even if we do happen to get negated by Gamma, still have that body there. I think it's a very important thing to remove for the opponent, and usually they don't give it the respect it deserves, and it sits and generates a lot of value. So next, we're going to dive into the Melffy extra deck monsters here. Take a look at Merry Melffys here first. Essentially what this is just a very simple Synchro 4 that when special summoned can target 1 face-up monster on the field and return it to the hand. Now, what is important about this is that it's not a synchro summon effect. So if this card is in your graveyard and you somehow resummon it through Monster Reborn or something of that degree, you can target 1 face-up monster on the field. Now, it is a once per turn, so if Zelantis banishes it and then resummons it, you're not going to get it again because it's a hard once per. Then the second effect, which is more Melffy-ish effect, is that while this card is actually on the board, normal, special summon, or targeted for an attack, it will return itself not to your hand but to the extra deck. Then it can special summon any Melffy XYZ monster from the extra deck to the board. So typically that's going to be Merry Melffy's returning back to special summon Forest, because Forest doesn't actually require a material to be detached to trigger its negate effect. If you chain link Merry Melffy's at the top of the chain link and Forest comes out first, by the time the lower chain link Melffy's trigger, you'll have a spot negate. You can also get into Joyous Melffy and use Joyous Melffy effect to target a different beast monster that does have material to then special summon whatever from the graveyard. That comes up less, but it is something you can get into. Now, you could technically summon Melffy Mommy as well, but I would very, very much advise against running that card in your deck. That's typically going to be your options, one of these 2 there, and for the reasons I just described. So that is that's Merry Melffy. Yeah, newer card, came out alongside Wally, Penny, and Staring Contest, but it really comes up a ton, is very flexible, puts itself back. Yeah, great, excellent card, very, very strong. So the next card is going to be Melffy of the Forest. We did touch on it a second here, but let's look at its effects really quickly. 2 level 2 monsters, right? So very easy for us to do. That's going to be any 2 level 2s. Now, it's important to know that Melffy of the Forest does not require beast monsters, right? So this is why things like Deep Sea Diva still work for us, is that you can get into Melffy of the Forest with any 2 level 2s. You can detach one of those materials. Doesn't have to be a Melffy material, doesn't have to be a beast material, anything like that. Just a straight up search of any Melffy in your deck, which is why when it is splashed into other archetypes, it's so powerful, because let's say you have 2 sprites on the board, you get into Melffy of the Forest, it can search its own caddy, which will then special summon itself in the end phase, which on your opponent's turn turns into a Merry Melffys, like we just talked about, to bounce 1, or a Herald of Arclight to be an Omni Negate. At the same time, when that caddy returns to the hand, it triggers the next effect on Melffy of the Forest, which states that if another face-up Melffy monster you control returns to your hand, you can target one face-up monster your opponent controls. It cannot attack. Also, its effects are negated while it is face-up on the field. Now that's big. It's slow, but it's big. You have to get pretty good at leveraging this because it doesn't trigger right away. It's very, very good at blocking like on summon effects. It's really good against Kashtira specifically. Anything that has to wait for an interaction to finish, it's not good at stopping quick effects because it obviously requires setup to operate. So similar to if you play Math Mech, they throw Aggregator into the graveyard, and that Aggregator does the same thing. After the fact, that effect comes up, and then you can target something on the field. So don't try to use it to stop quick effects or anything like that, or you'll just completely whiff. But yeah, very, very important to know that it can't attack, and its effects are negated for the entirety of the time it's on the field. Usually you save this for like a big boss monster, you lock it down and they can't use it. It just becomes like a giant brick on their side of the field, basically. Otherwise, you can use it for like Kashtira. Let's say that Melffy of the Forest and Wally are on the board. When Wally returns to the hand and special summons, that's going to trigger Kashtira, Unicorn, or Fenrir to either banish one of the extra deck of the field. But when they go to activate that, Melffy of the Forest can then block their ability, right? And stop them from being able to attack. So very, very awesome card in that matchup specifically. And lastly, of the Melffy cards we're going to be talking about here, this is Joyous Melffy. So Joyous Melffy is really the linchpin of our setup. It's what allows things that would otherwise be destroyed, like Rescue Cat and Obedience monsters, to be contained and then used on your opponent's turn. It's basically a Trojan horse. So what happens is Joyous Melffy can take 2 level 2 beast monsters or more, so as many as you can jam in that puppy if you'd like, but typically 2 or 3 or whatever beast monsters. Now it does have to be beasts, and they do have to be level 2, so that could be something like Wally, Puppy, Calantosa that you fish off of Obedience. And then on the opponent's turn, you can target 1 beast XYZ monster you control. It'll typically be Joyous because it'll have the most materials, but there are times where, like we talked about Merry Melffy, you might have Joyous come out and pop something else because it still has 1 material, and then you can get a Calantosa or something out of the graveyard for just 1 more extension. But yeah, typically it's going to be on your opponent's turn. You return Joyous Melffy to the extra deck, and when that happens, technically it's going to fish any 3 level 2 or lower beast monsters from the graveyard. Now, why is that distinction important? Well, because you could put Rabby, Valerawn, Kittytail into Joyous Melffy, leave it on the board, go to your opponent's turn, use this effect, return it to the extra deck, and then because you have, Wally, Puppy, and Caddy in the graveyard, you could summon those 3 instead, right? So it doesn't have to be the 3 materials that make up Joyous Melffy. Now, typically, especially on turn 1, it will be, just because you don't have much in the graveyard to work with otherwise, but that is something that's important to know for the grind game. As the grind game goes longer, that effect becomes more and more relevant. Now, there is also another secondary effect. It comes up a lot less, but it is really, really nice. People forget about it, and it allows us to get into Zeus as easily as we do. So that states that this is on our turn. You can detach 1 material from the card, and all Melffy monsters you have can all of a sudden attack directly. Now, typically what that's going to look like is dropping 1 material so that Joyous can attack directly, turning into Zeus to clear the board, right? So not unlike the Lyra Lusk or Borbo approaches. Joyous Melffy, detach 1, smash, and then turn into Zeus or whatever. And sometimes you can just end the game. It's 2,000 damage, and it's pretty easy to get into. Sometimes you can straight up just detach one material, bypass everything, and hit for 2,000, and the opponent, has set up this really robust board that doesn't matter. Joyous Melffy, very important Trojan horse effect. Really, really important card. People a lot of the times ask me how many of each we need. I would say that one of each is obviously minimum. I wouldn't be totally against having 2 Joyous. I feel like Joyous could be the card to have more than one of, simply because if it does get shut down, that really does hurt your ability to succeed on further turns. Things like Naturia Unicorn, if the player knows what they're doing and they get rid of Joyous, that could really, really be damaging. But yeah, if you ever lose Joyous, especially if you use Obedience and then they ditch your Joyous or something from the extra deck, you're just left to leave your monsters to pop. So yeah, it can be very, very damaging. So next we're going to talk about some cards that they're not Melffy cards, but they might as well be. And those are the Mystical Beasts. And from here, we're just going to take 1 Calantosa, 1 Valerawn, and 1 Kitty Tail. Currently, this is what I run. Now, just touching quickly on what these do. Calantosa is one of the bread and butter combos we've done for a very long time. If this card is special summoned by the effect of a beast monster specifically, you can target 1 card on the field, destroy that target. So even though there's not a whole lot of text there, there is actually a lot being said there, right? So if this card is special summoned by the effect of a beast monster, so that means it won't work off of things like Spright Elf, because it's thunder, but it will work off of Valerawn effect or puppy effect or Finny effect. Now this next part says you can target 1 card on the field. So that means it's optional. You don't have to pop anything. So you can special summon it if something on the board changes. For instance, let's say the opponent tributes something or some capacity. There's nothing left to pop. You're not then forced to pop one of your own. You can just decline the effect. And it also targets, right? This word target here means that anything that says hey, you can't target cards. Something that comes to mind is the Pearly Field spell. You can't target the special summoned Pearlies during the turn they were special summoned. So this is targeting destruction. Would not help you much in that scenario. So that's an important thing to know. So next up is Valerawn. Valerawn, pretty simple card. It is a tuner, so it's very valuable. Just make sure you know where your tuners are at all times. And you can take advantage of the effect, which states you can discard 1 card, then target 1 level 2 or lower beast monster in your graveyard, except Valerawn. Now, it's important to know that Valerawn's wording can be a little tricky. You don't discard 1 card and then target, right? You discard 1 card and target, essentially. So you can't, for instance, discard a beast from your hand and then target that same beast to summon it back out and creating Valerawn as a 1 card starter. It doesn't work that way, unfortunately. It does require you discard 1 card and 1 level 2 or lower beast does exist in your graveyard already. Then you can throw Calantosa and resummon Calantosa, but there still needs to be that beast already in there in order to take advantage of activating the effect to begin with. So key distinction there, always worth remembering. So the next card on our list is going to be Kitty Tail. Now this is one of my favorite cards in the game because it is super flexible. Now it can get into a ton of different things, and we'll save all those nitty-gritty details for the combo section later on. For now, we'll just kind of approach what Kitty Tail does. So obviously level 2 beast, and if this card is normal or special summoned, you can target 1 beast, beast warrior, winged beast, insect, or plant monster in your graveyard. Send 1 monster from your deck to the graveyard with the same type as that monster. So this card was, I think, worded a little bit better than Valerawn, even though it's essentially telling you the same thing. You have to already have in your graveyard one of these to exist. The secondary effect, which is also huge, is it's just a raw search for any of the types mentioned previously, and you can take that card from your deck and add it to your hand. So like I mentioned, you can just crash it, run Kitty Tail into opponent cards, break it down, search something much better, like a Melffy for instance, and then you can special summon in the end phase with the Melffy effect. Or you can search Alpha and then special summon Alpha and remove some cards from the field. It's a really kooky card. It does take a good bit of getting used to and the different branches and things that it can push you down. But yeah, really stellar card, big fan. So the next cards we're going to talk about, Rescue Cat. People ask me all the time, is there anything that I can do to swap this card out? Like, is it required? Is it mandatory? And unfortunately, I got to tell you it is. And it is one of our very few cards we run at 3 because it is a very key starter. Rescue Cat and Obedience Schooled both, you just can't afford to run them at any less than 3. Rescue Cat, really great card. It's also great in other decks as well, so I would just craft it and hold on to it personally, but hey, that's just me. So yeah, Rescue Cat, most people are familiar. You will send it from the field to the graveyard, and then you can special summon 2 level 3 or lower beast monsters from your deck. Now that's cool because it goes up to level 3, which allows us to search Pero and Valerawn, which is a 1-card Naturia beast. You could also do like Kitty Tail and Wally and then Spright Elf. So yeah, Rescue Cat, very important. It is one of our bread and butter starters. Does really suck because it is weak to just a single ash or something. But yeah, I can't live without this card. I highly recommend you craft it, hold on to it, because it's going to be good other than just Melffys. It's not a totally sunk cost. Now, while we're talking about the 3F starters, you gotta mention Obedience Schooled. One of the most powerful cards just straight up in the game. It summons 3 monsters from your deck. 3 monsters from your deck. And they do have to be different names. Their effects are negated, and they are destroyed during the end phase. Now, Rescue Cat can summon 2 Wallies if you want to. Obedience Schooled cannot. It has to be 3 effect monsters with different names. Now, because every beast monster in our deck is an effect monster, we're not super worried about that. Typically, you're going to summon things like Kitty Tail, Wally, Pony, or Wally, Puppy, Calantosa, you know, just really a ton of different combinations you could do with this card, especially considering like what else you might have in your hands, because you can normal summon a card and all of a sudden get into 2 separate XYZs. This card is huge. It's crazy powerful. I'd run it at 10 if they'd let me. All the drawbacks, for instance, the beast lock is a massive one. So if you're ever thinking like, okay, I need to get into Zeus to clear this inboard, you can't, right? Because you'll Obedience Schooled, you'll get into Joyous, you'll attack, and then you'll be like, oh no, I'm beast locked. I can't actually get into Zeus. So just make sure that doesn't catch you off guard. Next up on the list, we're going to do one more one of, and that's going to be good old Hoppier Squadron. Now, Hoppier Squadron, people are very familiar with. This card has been around for a while, but just in case you're not, what this card does is during your opponent's main phase, now it is main phase required, so you can't shotgun it, but you can target 1 phase up monster you control. Special summon this card from your hand, and if you do, immediately after it resolves, synchro summon 1 synchro monster using only this card and the target. So there are a couple differences between this and Penny and how they operate. Both are obviously searchable, so you can search Hoppier off of Caddy. And during the opponent's main phase, we'll typically target Calantosa after it's already used its pop, and then turn that into a level 4 body for Merry Melffys, right? You can also get really cheeky with this card and use it on things like a Kaiju. You hit Hoppier on Lava Golem, boom, you got a Baronne. Same thing with Alpha when we talk about that. Level 8 as well, so you can use that to get into Baronne or Satellite Warrior or something. So yeah, really cool card. You can use it to hit Merry Melffy or Herald of the Arclight and turn that into Locust, which can then get you into the 8s and the 10s. Next is one of our last one-ofs, and that's going to be Pero Cerberus. You've heard me talk about it. And as it states, if you take damage by battle or an opponent's card effect while this card is in the graveyard, you can banish this card from the graveyard, then target 1 card on the field, destroy it. So a couple things. It is card effect or battle damage, right? Like we mentioned with Kitty Tail, if you force damage in battle, it'll still trigger it, right? So it's a very easy card to actually trigger on your own turn to use as just a straight up piece of removal. Now, we also don't have a ton of back row removal just in Melffy as a whole. So this is a card that can like really save you and out a skill drain or out a Imperial Order or whatever when those existed and were a really big deal. You could throw it in the graveyard off of the Kitty Tail effect and it's pretty easy to get in there. You banish it and it's gone. Now keep in mind that if you do banish this card to take advantage of this effect, you do lose access to getting into Naturia Beast. The next card on the list is going to be Alpha Master of the Beast. Now this card is pretty well known, but if you're not familiar with what it does, cannot ever be normal summoned or set. It has to be special summoned from your hand by the effect of the total attack of all monsters your opponent controls being higher than those you control. And because we run Melffy with very low attack and stuff like that, very easy to trigger. Now keep in mind, Obedience, for instance, requires no monsters be controlled, so you have to Obedience first and then Alpha on top of it. So when you Obedience, you want to make sure that you don't bring out like Caress or something that has a much higher attack than most of the other Melffys. Can also be used with Hoppier to get into a level 10, like we talked about. And then its secondary effect is once it's on the field, you can target any beast, beast warrior, or winged beast monsters you control, return them to the hand, and then you can return face-up monsters your opponent controls equal to the amount of cards you just returned to your hand. So what does that mean? Essentially, you special summon this card, you activate it, you'll hit Wally and Puppy and Alpha. All three will return to your hand. You return 3 face-up monsters your opponent controls. Go to pass your turn, you just special summon the Melffys in the end phase. Next card we're going to talk about here is going to be Deep Sea Diva. And now Deep Sea Diva, we run it 2, and really just exists to be a replacement for Nimble Beaver ever since he got banned. So unfortunately not a beast, so it's not easily searchable and things like that. You really just have it in the deck so that you can have a chance at drawing it going first. As the card effect states here, normal summon this from your hand, and then it will special summon a copy of itself, basically. You can turn that into a Melffy of the Forest XYZ. You can detach one material, grab Wally, and now you have an inboard. Throw Steed at it, and get into Excel Synchro or Baronne. This into SP Knight or Spright Elf. You know, it's one card into all those as well. Mosquito, if you run that. Just a Nimble Beaver replacement. The second that that guy gets freed from his prison, we'll be throwing him right back in. So for the time being, I like it at 2. All right, next up on the list, we have a pretty recent addition, is Steed. Now, Steed is a card we run at 3 because it is one of the only extenders we even have available to us. This allows us to special summon if we have a level 2 on the board. So similar to the Spright effect. So we can still use this to get into things like Spright Elf. We can still use this to get into things like Excel Synchro Dragon or SP Little Knight, because those don't have restrictions based on level or anything like that. It is really handy to, like I mentioned with Diva, let's say you normal summon Diva, and that gets negated by Ash. You throw out the Steed inherent summon, by the way, so sync into Excel Synchro Dragon, and then go down that whole line into an unaffected Baronne. And then if you have Wally or something in your hand, you summon that in the end phase, and you have a really competent board through an Ash. That Steed's ability to play through interruption is really, really nice. So let's talk about its second effect. Now, the first effect, obviously, you special summons itself from the hand. The second effect is a little different. So when a monster declares an attack and this card is in your graveyard, you can banish it from the graveyard, target one card you control. That's any card you control. It can be face down, face up, back row, front row, monster, spell, whatever. Negate the attack, and if you do negate that attack, destroy that targeted card. So a couple of things about how that's worded. The first is, obviously, it has to be in the graveyard. When a monster triggers an attack on any of your monsters, you can target one card you control. So if that's a hide and seek, or if you have hide and seek on the board, you can target a beast, and that beast won't be destroyed. It doesn't matter, right? As long as you target it, it's going to be good to go. And if you negate the attack, it's going to destroy. But hide and seek, protecting it does not disqualify the previous things that happened before, right? Also, if that attack is not negated for whatever reason, you no longer have to destroy your card because you didn't negate the attack from that monster. Does that make sense? The real key to this is, like I mentioned with Diva or any level 2 synchro, typically you'll have a level 2 synchro on board, special summon Steed, turn Steed into Varm. Then when you're triggering an attack on Varm in the battle phase, Steed can be banished from the graveyard to pop Valerawn, and that will clear all face-up cards in general your opponent controls. Now, the next card we're going to talk about is actually a really recent addition and is really just a tech for the current meta, especially against decks like Yubel and Snake Eye Fire King. And that is going to be King Tiger Wanghu. Now, this card states that if a monster with 1400 or less attack is normal or special summoned while you control this card, destroy those monsters with 1400 or less attack. This card must be face up on the field to activate and resolve this effect. So if at any point between activation and resolution it gets removed by something, it won't finish resolving. Now, it's worth mentioning that this is a floodgate. This is a proper floodgate, a really old one, but a floodgate nonetheless. And it does negatively impact us as well. So our answer to this would be the first effect here on hide and seek. So anytime you have hide and seek on the board while he's on the board, you are pretty much just protected, except for Diva, from KTW's destruction effect. That allows us to basically play like normal while the opponent can't use anything that qualifies for KTW's destruction. So it's very, very strong in the Yubel matchup. I typically only get this card out when having this card on the board wins me the game. You can link it off or Hoppier it off or things like that, but if it flips back to your turn and you don't have a good way to get rid of it or hide and seek, it does become a little tricky. So keep that in mind. Now from here, we're going to skip straight to the extra deck section because all that's left here is to fill this out with tech cards, and I'm going to save that for last just because it requires the least amount of time. They're the most generic that people are most familiar with. However, the extra deck still has a lot of specific monsters with specific interactions that relate to the core of the engine as a whole, so we're going to dive into that next. So the next card we're going to talk about here is the Herald of Arclight, and we're going to talk about the top 2 effects, right? The third one isn't really relevant to us. We don't use it in this deck list. If you play Drytron or something, maybe you'd be more familiar. But we're going to focus on the top 2. Now, the first one is the Floodgate effect, and it's why we are pretty good at things like the Tearlaments matchup, Horus as well. And what it states is that any monster sent from the hand or main deck to the graveyard is banished instead. So if they're activating Sark and they discard something, it's going to the graveyard. Tearlaments goes to the graveyard. All that stuff is getting banished instead, right? That's very, very powerful for us in those matchups specifically. And then the next effect is the one most people are more familiar with just because that's typically what you get into this card for, and it's just a straight up Omni. Everybody loves a good Omni. It states that when an effect is activated, you tribute this card, negate the activation, and if you do, destroy that card. So very, very good negate. It is susceptible due to the tribute functionality to Call by the Grave and things like that. The Floodgate does go both ways. So if you use Penny to synchro summon, the 2 cards that come from your hand are getting banished. But yeah, in specific matchups, very, very powerful. Definitely be familiar and ready to use this card at a moment's notice. Next on the list, we have Naturia Beast. So Naturia Beast is really, really powerful Floodgate effect. Basically just turns off spell cards for your opponent. Now we really only get into this card either first or never, just because we do have to commit Pero to it, which in turn removes his ability to be leveraged for a pop earlier than that. Now, however, it does get Pero into the graveyard. It just requires Valerawn and Pero to come out of Rescue Cat to do so. Alternatively, you can have like Obedience in hand, get Valerawn off of that, hard summon Pero, so you only really need that in your hands. But yeah, it's a great card for the times that it works. I would say 60% of the time you get this card on the board, it's an instant win. But the times that you don't, it pretty much loses you the game because it does require a good amount of resources to get into. So if you open up Naturia Beast against something like Labyrinth, you're gonna have a bad time. That being said, at the same time, decks like Pearly or Sky Striker are pretty much instant wins, so if you do play in tournaments or something like that and you know what you're playing against, this becomes even more powerful. Next on the list is going to be Desert Locust. So Desert Locust is one of our extension synchros, just like Excel Synchro Dragon. This is a level 6 tuner synchro monster, and it states that if this card is synchro summoned, the turn player discards 1 card. Now it's very important, don't get into this card on your own turn unless you're ready to get rid of something. Typically you want to reserve this for opening it on your opponent's turn via the Penny effect, discards 1 from the opponent's hand, and then the second effect is eligible at any point, so long as you have bodies on the board to fulfill that effect, and it states that once per chain during your opponent's main phase, you can quick effect immediately after this effect resolves, synchro summon using this card. That's important to understand the wording of once per chain, meaning that you can really sit on it at any point, it can go off. However, that's just the activation, keep in mind. So it takes the entire chain resolving for you to decide what you want to synchro into. It's not immediately as soon as you activate, right? And that is important because if anything gets chained higher than that, obviously you are susceptible to some kind of interruption. But Desert Locust, really strong card, lets us use even fewer Melffys to get into higher level synchro monsters. Have to have it in the deck. The discard 1 is just icing on the cake. So the next 3 cards we're going to talk about, we're actually going to talk about all together because they work as basically a singular piece. It's very rare that you'll use one without also utilizing the other. It does come up, but very rarely. And to piggyback off Locust, Locust usually turns into Excel Synchro Stardust Dragon. So we'll add 1 Excel Synchro, 1 Satellite Warrior, and 1 Stardust. And that is our satellite line. Right. So we go from Desert Locust to use another body on the board to turn into Excel Synchro. Excel Synchro then special summons a level 2 or lower tuner from the graveyard. Now that'll be Penny because that's what we use to get into Locust. So Penny comes back out, and then at any point, you don't have to use it immediately, you can tribute this card. Now as soon as you tribute it, there's no activation on Stardust, right? Once it lands, you turn into a 10 or whatever. But yeah, essentially, just like I said, whenever you trigger this, it'll tribute itself. Stardust will come out. It's treated as a synchro summon, and then you use anything on the field, actually, at that point. So you actually don't have to use Stardust or Penny. Like if you have, let's say, Valerawn and Wally on the board as well, you can actually just target them and turn them into an unaffected Herald, and then just keep Stardust on the board, and Penny, I guess, and take advantage of Stardust effect at any point where you can tribute itself to negate something. So yeah, there are some different plays you can get into. There's flexibility there, but essentially, kind of go back over, you're going to Locust into Excel. Excel pulls out Stardust. Stardust turns into Satellite, and because we have 1, 2, 3 synchro monsters in our graveyard, we get to pop 3 cards on the field. Now it is targeted, so keep that in mind. And the cards do have to be destroyed in order to gain the attack. So if they, for some reason, get moved off the board instead of being destroyed, then you won't actually gain the attack despite having targeted them. You still, however, will be unaffected for the remainder of the turn that you synchro anything using the Excel Synchros effect. That synchro monster is unaffected by activated effects. So Satellite Warrior is unaffected. It's typically after 3 pops, 5,500. And another thing that comes up secondarily that people don't really pay too much attention to is that once it's destroyed, Stardust and Excel come right back out. Right? And all of a sudden, you have 2 level 8s on the board. You can throw down a level 2, get into Baronne, you can do a lot of stuff, right? Different packages require different cards to be in the deck for this line, but that is the bread and butter as I've described it here, just to kind of save having to read into each card specifically. That's the concept. So from the Stardust characters, we will talk about Varm. So Varm is a really interesting card. It's been around since the 6.x era, and we only actually need to read this one part because nothing else is relevant to us. If this synchro summon card is destroyed, you can destroy all face-up cards your opponent controls. Ways that we can pop this after it's been summoned are Puppy into Calantosa or Finny into Calantosa or whatever. Using the Steed effect from the graveyard, especially if you Hoppier onto Steed to turn into Valerawn, you now have that Steed in the graveyard to pop Valerawn at any point. Pero in the graveyard, you can use it to pop Valerawn as well. So there are ways to take advantage of that destruction. Typically, you don't want it to be your only inboard. So the next card on the list is going to be Baronne de Fleur. Once per turn, you can target a card on the field and destroy it. And it's also a once while the card is face up on the field Omni. So that's, those 2 effects are primarily why you get this big bad out. Now, it also does have this interesting effect here that during the standby phase, after you've used your negate, typically, you can get rid of this card, return it to the extra deck, and then special summon maybe the Excel Synchro or the Locust again on your opponent's turn, right? Or get into a Wally or something if you want to get that chain moving, because this is just a 3,000 body once, your negate's gone. So that is an interesting play that does sometimes surprise people, so keep that in mind. But typically, we get into this from a Hoppier onto Alpha or something of that degree, a Hoppier onto Valerawn, or Locust. I guess you could Locust plus Mary Melffy's into Baronne. You could technically do the Satellite line and just replace Baronne and Satellite, but getting into an unaffected Baronne doesn't really do a whole lot comparatively, just because 3,000 is kind of easy to beat over. But yeah, it's Baronne de Fleur. Never a bad card to get out on the field. All right, next up is going to be number 64, Ronin Raccoon Sendayu. Refer to him as Sendayu or Raccoon or whatever. Really, really awesome card. Doesn't get enough credit. In my opinion, arguably more important than Zeus, even since the beginning. This card allows us to go toe-to-toe with so many meta decks, especially in the era of dealing with things like Eldritch. Essentially, what this card does is for 2 level 2 beast monsters, which is most of our deck, you XYZ into this beast, XYZ, you detach 1 material, and then it's going to special summon a Raccoon token that is going to have the same amount of attack as the highest amount of attack monster on the field. On your field, that could be on your opponent's field. It doesn't matter. So if they throw out some huge The Arrival, you can actually just sendayu and get a 6,000 0 token, crash into that Arrival. You're good to go, right? So yeah, very, very useful card to get over the biggest and the baddest. Also, to push for lethal, very, very useful. Now, it's worth mentioning that while you control another beast-type monster, so that includes its own token, this card can't be destroyed by battle or card effects, so you can actually use this to get into Zeus if you want. You can crash this into something, knowing that you won't lose it, and spin it into Zeus on the MP2. Next up on the list, So this is Zeus. Everybody should be familiar with Zeus. If not, I beg of you to read cards because you're going to see him a lot in tons of different decks. So once per turn, if an XYZ monster battled this turn, you can turn them into Zeus, right? So that's typically how you're going to summon it. Ignore the level 2 or level 12 stuff. And then, of course, Zeus effect is you detach 2 materials and you clear the entire board. That's on your side and the opponent's side. It is a send to graveyard, not a destroy effect. So it does get around a lot of those destruction protections. And yeah, typically you'll just joyous into this or raccoon into this or whatever for the board clear. Now, the second effect doesn't come up nearly as often, is that once per turn, if another card is destroyed by battle or an opponent's card effect, so you can't pop it with your own Kalantosa, you can attach 1 card from anywhere. So that's really, really handy to sometimes be like, okay, Zeus has 0 mats, he's about to get linked off. I just got that trigger effect. I'm gonna grab Pero from my deck so that when I link Zeus off, boom, I got that card in my graveyard, right? So yeah, keep that in mind. It's Zeus, not a whole lot more to say. So next on the list, we're going to talk about Spright Elf. Is a really interesting card that I highly suggest people run just for its recursion alone or its protection alone. I would run it, but the fact that it does both in 1 card is extraordinary. Also, it only requires 1 level 2 monster, right? So the other monster can be anything, which means that you can turn Wally and Steed into Spright Elf and then resummon Wally, and you have a protected Wally for the next turn. You can fish something like Rescue Cat, Valerawn, Kalantosa, turn Valerawn and Kalantosa into Spright Elf. Spright Elf brings Valerawn back. Valerawn discard 1s, special summons Kalantosa, pop 1 on the board, and then turn that into whatever you want, SP Little Knight maybe, and now you have an SP protected by Spright Elf. A really, really strong card. People scoop when they see it a lot because it's just frustrating to get off the board. Like I mentioned, it does have its own built-in protection. So again, the effect is that you can target 1 level 2 monster in your graveyard, or if your opponent has a monster on the field, you can do a rank or link to instead. So sometimes you can bring out your forest or something if it's in the graveyard. Usually we will special summon a Wally or a Melffy of some sort on the opponent's turn to take advantage of their effects from the graveyard. So great card for that. And then also very important to summon Wally or whatever Melffy specifically to the arrows that it points to here, because these arrows protect these monsters from being targeted by card effects. So you're still susceptible to something like Ash, but Valor, Imperm, and targeting effects like that won't be able to hit you, so that's really nice. Now, for the sake of the video here, we're just going to put SP Little Knight in as our 15th, and we're going to talk about that. You should be familiar with this card. It's everywhere. 2 effect monsters, not limited to level or anything, just straight up 2 effect monsters. If you link summon it using either a Fusion, Synchro, XYZ, or Link monster as part of one of the 2 effect monsters, you get a free banish, right? It's targeted banish, and you can't attack directly after you use it. So typically you use it in MP2, or you use it in MP1 if you have to get rid of something extremely problematic like a big boss or a floodgate. The second effect is that when your opponent activates a card or effect, you can target 2 face-up monsters on the field. One has to be one that you control. They can both be one that you control, but one has to be one that you control. You banish both of those cards until the end phase, at which point they are just brought back, not special summoned or anything, just placed back. This card is extremely easy for almost every deck in the game to get into. Depending on how you get into it, it can be 2 interruptions. For very, very few resources, it's just a really stellar card. You can just really get into disgusting stuff with what is seemingly a very small board. Now, all we have left to talk about are the tech cards, and we'll breeze through these pretty quickly as they are the most generic and most common. Most people should be familiar with how they operate. So we're going to start with the big bad himself, Max C. Just wins games. I don't like it. You don't have to like it, but it exists, and that's how it is. Just send this card from your hand to the graveyard, and every time your opponent special summons a monster, you draw 1 card. So it just murders combo decks. Next up, we have Max C's counterpart, Ash, Blossom, and Joyous Spring. So again, another hand trap. You just discard this to the graveyard to negate any interactions the opponent might have with his deck. So that's add a card, special summon, send a card from the deck to the graveyard. Really strong card, great piece of interruption, a staple. You should always have it. Now, the next staple that I recommend you always have is Called by the Grave. Now, this is huge in our deck specifically because it is 1 piece of protection against negates, which we are very weak to, as well as one of the ways we have to stop Max C, which can be just devastating to us. The next card we're going to talk about here is going to be Cross Out Designator. Now, back in the day, we used to run this at 3, good times, but now it is limited to 1, just like Called By is limited to 2. So Cross Out is basically a third Called By. It gets treated like that. It's just going to exist to protect your Melffys from negation, just like Called By would. It does have a little bit more flexibility. It can target things like Imperm or other Called Bys, whereas Called By has to target monsters in the graveyard. You're going to be using it in the same capacity to protect yourself from things like Max C, Ash Blossom, Imperm, and Called By the Grave. Now, for the last card in our deck, Speak of the Devil, He Shall Appear. It's infinite impermanence. We all know what this is. It's a multifaceted tool. It can be a hand trap, it could be a regular trap, and negates one face-up monster your opponent controls until the end of the turn. Now, it's really great because cards that have multiple effects, like Snake Eyes Ash, for instance, this takes care of both. They can't use both effects now. So very, very strong in that respect. A lot of its value comes from the fact can't be hit by Called By. So if you go first and you set it, you take advantage of the fact that whatever column you set it in, spell and traps can't be activated. Very handy use there. And then if you go second, it just acts as a hand trap because you take advantage of the effect where it says if you control no cards, you can activate it from hand. It's also not once per turn, so if you open up multiple infinite impermanences, you can use multiple. A very strong card. It's everywhere right now. Get used to seeing it and run Cross Out because it's not going anywhere. So that's going to be the end of part 1, the deck profile. Look out for the next part where we will cover what packs to open, crafting the deck, the best, most optimal way to do that, and then we'll jump into the rank ladder and do some commentary over matches. So I appreciate you guys sticking this one out for me. If you do have any questions, feel free to throw them in the comments below. You can find me on Discord at Palmer. Otherwise, I hope you guys have a great rest of your day, and I'll see you next time.